First, you have to believe that you're a Satanist. And then you have to come to a point of no return. Crime, murder. Once you get to that point, you really hold power over the others.
In the beginning, the police believed that Fabio and Chiara had run away.
Because I held in my hands the transcripts of all their testimonies, and they all described the facts in an identical manner, I'm surprised that no one realized that the accused must have agreed on a common story.
My first reaction was to think that Volpe had killed him.
The end result is that the devil, if you believe in him, has won.
On January 17, 1998, around 11 p.m., Michel Tolles receives a phone call from his son Fabio. In a hesitant voice, Fabio tells his father he won't be coming home. He wants to spend the night with his girlfriend, Chiara Marino, who is 3 years older than him.
No. Torni a casa.
Half asleep, Michel Tolles asks Fabio to come home, for he considers it inappropriate behavior for a 16-year-old adolescent.
Usually my son speaks in a very confident manner. That night, it felt strange to me. He was hesitating, almost mumbling. I had the impression that someone was telling him what to say on the phone, or that perhaps he was under the influence of drugs or alcohol. I told him, no, you went to town. Have you had one too many? I want you to come back home as usual, and if it's too late to take the bus, just call me and I'll pick you up. Very well, Dad. The way he was speaking didn't make me too suspicious. But let's just say it made me worried enough that I got dressed to go and get him, because I was still in my pajamas. I said to myself, I hope he doesn't do anything silly with Chiara. She's so young. At that time, I thought she was a minor like my son, and I didn't want any trouble with her parents.
Why did Fabio call? He knew his father would surely not grant his permission. Michel has a keen intuition that something is afoot. Although it's almost midnight, the father heads for the Midnight Pub, a club in Milan where heavy metal music fans hang out. He knows that his son and the Circus of Satan band members go there regularly.
It took me a good 30 minutes to get to the Midnight Pub in Milan.
Michel Tolles shows up at the Midnight Pub, meets the people who are there. Of course, everyone knows Fabio.
In the pub, the first person who came to me was Paolo Leoni, a.k.a. Ozzy. He gave himself that name because he admired Ozzy Osbourne.
Paolo Leoni is one of the members of Fabio's band and also works at the Midnight Pub as a waiter.
He recognized me. He'd occasionally seen me before when I was picking up Fabio. So he asked me, Mr. Tolles, what are you doing here? What do you mean, what am I doing here? I'm here to pick up Fabio. He phoned me. Leoni says that's right. Fabio left with Chiara a while ago to go to the bistro next door, because they don't let us use the phone at the midnight. I go to the bistro next door, I ask the owner, he says, yes, I saw them. It's true there's a lot of people on Saturdays, but Fabio came in to buy phone tokens. He was with Chiara, but I can't remember what he said on the phone or if he was with other people. It's too busy on Saturdays. There's too much work. That's what he confirmed. I told him, fine, thank you.
Paolo Leoni follows Michel Tolles up to the bistro and tells him there's a vacant construction site nearby where Fabio and Chiara might be.
Leoni tells me there's a construction site nearby that's very quiet at night, Maybe the two lovebirds wanted to be alone. Chiara had seemed very interested in Fabio for a while. So I tell him, wait a minute, I never heard about that Chiara. I don't know who she is, I've never seen her. Leone tells me, okay, maybe we can look for them. So we visit several pubs in the vicinity. I keep asking him questions about Chiara, where she comes from, who she is. And Ozzy tells me that she's a friend of his, that she lives near him in Corsico. He adds that he too is getting worried because it's past midnight and normally they come back together on the last subway train. I ask him if he has Chiara's number so I can call them just to know if they're home yet. He says yes, she lives with her parents, and he gives me the number. I call, Chiara's mother answers. I tell her who I am and that my son Fabio had called me to say he was taking Chiara home. Are they there yet? She says no, and adds that Chiara had left with Ozzy. So normally she should have come back with him.
After talking to Chiara's mother, Michelle Tollis continues to search, accompanied by Paolo Leone and 4 other Circus of Satan band members.
I kept on looking for them with Paolo Leone and other members of the group. Naturally, one by one, they started to slip away. First Guerrieri, then Monterosso, then Zampolo, who said he had a ride with a friend. So the only ones left are Ozzy and Massimino Magni. Around 1:30 in the morning, Ozzy says that he has a friend who can bring him back to Corsico, and that he really has to leave. Sooner or later, the two lovebirds will certainly come back home, he said with a smile.
But when he comes back, he notices that Fabio's bed is empty. So Fabio has decided to sleep out despite his parents' request to come back home.
When I came back, the first thing my wife, with her maternal instinct, told me was, if Fabio's not back, then something must have happened to him. We tried to reassure ourselves, but finally I didn't sleep all night. At 7 a.m. I told my wife I'm going to Chiara's house in Corsico. So I get there around 7:30 in the morning, convinced that I'm going to find them there. But as soon as I get there, I realize they're not home. And that Chiara's parents are also very worried. We agree that the first one to get word will call the other. I give them my number, my home number, and I leave.
Michelle Tollis finally decides to go to the police station.
Michelle Tollis can't hide his concern. He tells the policeman that he's convinced something serious has happened to his son.
I don't know if he was an officer, a brigadier, or a simple carabinieri, but he told me, Mr. Tollis, they're young. They didn't come home for just one night. Don't start thinking that something terrible has happened. Anyway, it's impossible to file a missing persons report before at least 48 hours.
Back home, Michelle Tollis sets about contacting all of Fabio's acquaintances, including each one of the Circus of Satan's band members.
Everybody told me the same thing. Every musician, every member of Circus of Satan gave me exactly the same story. Fabio and Chiara went out to phone and never came back. In fact, that was the same version I had had the previous day from Leone, Guerrieri, Monterosso, Zampolo, and Magni. Based on that information, we decided to meet that afternoon at Sempione Park to organize a search. So later that afternoon, I met the members of the group in the park. And that's where I first met Volpe and Sapone.
With Paolo Leone, Nicola Sapone, and one of the co-founders of Circus of Satan, Andrea Volpe joins the group shortly after. At first, Circus of Satan was simply a thrash metal band who covered Black Sabbath hits. Soon after, Volpe and Sapone, both alcoholics and drug addicts, began to vandalize and ransack cemeteries in order to steal decorative items for their shows. One thing leads to another. Volpe and Sapone drag other band members into a satanic cult.
Then when his son disappeared, of course he reported it to the police. His son was a minor when he disappeared. The girl, for her part, wasn't. And then the police undertook a small, perfunctory investigation.
At the start of the investigation, when they were making searches, I can at least say that the policemen never even bothered to search Fabio's room at my house. I had to bring them some elements myself and tell them about Fabio's habits, friends, and acquaintances.
During the investigation, they searched Chiara's room. They found an altar with inverted crosses and satanic verses.
So the young lady seems involved in occult practices, but there's nothing that suggests that something tragic may have occurred. So for the policeman, it's a matter of a 19-year-old girl going out with a 16-year-old boy. Something that's not necessarily well accepted. Understandably, the policemen declare that the young lovers have run away, and they will recommend that Michelle Tallis and Chiara Marino's mother stay at home until at some point their children will contact them and come back home.
Fabio's father never believed this hypothesis, and he began to search on his own.
I had had posters printed up with Fabio and Chiara's pictures. I had started putting them up in Corsico, in Milan. I had started doing this since the first few days.
At the same time, the Cologno Monzese police do as little as possible. The investigation of Fabio Tallis and Chiara Marino's disappearance is at a standstill right from the start.
Instead, the policemen had tried to prevent me from doing anything. They wanted me to stay quiet. They thought I was too tedious and insistent. The sergeant from Cologno Monzese was exasperated and even told me I was busting their balls.
10 days go by. The Tallis family and the Marino family call upon the population through the media. Some information generates slight interest but leads nowhere. When Michelle Tallis learns that Chiara Marino's room was filled with satanic paraphernalia, he decides to reorient his investigation towards the world of heavy metal and thrash metal bands. He visits Milan bars and systematically interrogates his son's friends and acquaintances.
I had collected some information on the regulars at the midnight pub. Someone told me that a lot of those who hung out at the bar subscribed to Satanism, all gathered around Ozzy Leone, but my contact was scared to tell me the others' names. One night while searching around Corsico, I met a man walking his dog, and he warned me to avoid the area, that it was dangerous. So a few days later, I decided to show up, unannounced, at Paolo Leone's. Politely, his mother asked me in, and even showed me around her son's room. There were antique goblets, demon figurines, a goat skull on the wall, black sheets, those kinds of things.
What's strange in Fabio Tallis and Chiara Marino's disappearance is that the policemen will continue to favor the theory that the two have run away, despite the fact that the parents keep presenting evidence that seem to discredit that theory.
Michelle Tallis insists something isn't quite right with the testimonies provided by Circus of Satan band members.
The story the members of the group told was basically cut and paste. It was a photocopy of the other story. So I told myself, why don't the carabinieri in Cologno and Corsico and the policemen in Milan realize that this version is a setup, since they have in hand all those identical testimonies?
Sembra una cosa tutta concordata.
It's impossible for all the members to recall the events using the same details and the same words.
A posteriori,
I now realize that that's what pushed me to pursue my research with added determination.
oltre diciamo al desiderio di ritrovarlo comunque sia, di ritrovare
I decided to get closer to that world of heavy metal bands,
che poi mi ha portato
to try to understand where my son could be, since he was influenced by this marginal culture.
Despite his efforts, Michel Tollis won't succeed in tracking down his son Fabio. As time goes by, Fabio Tollis and Chiara Marino's disappearance will become a cold case. At the crack of dawn on January 24, 2004, the Sommo Lombardo Carabinieri in the province of Varese receive a phone call.
The owner of a business in Sommo Lombardo reported having seen a young man walking the streets with a dazed look, talking to himself. He seemed to be under the influence of drugs. The Carabinieri, dispatched to the scene, found a man named Volpe, who did indeed seem delirious.
Right from the start, the police realize that the man is not in a normal state. Agent Capo Greco asks him to calm down and explain what's wrong. The young man, about 20 years old, is Andrea Volpe and admits that he's taken a cocaine, heroin, and amphetamine cocktail.
After interrogating that young man for a while, this Andrea Volpe, he starts to come to his senses. He starts to tell a rather flimsy story. He says he'd been driving along, followed by his girlfriend, Elisabetta Ballerin, and that suddenly he had swerved. And when he looked, his girlfriend's car was no longer behind him. And then he tells the policeman, without going into details, that he's afraid his girlfriend might have been assaulted and that he doesn't know where she is. All this seems a bit mysterious.
It was a lie. When the Carabinieri finally found the young girl's car, Elisabetta Ballerin was inside. She was pale and foaming at the mouth. Once questioned by the policeman, she barely opened her eyes before drifting off once more. They called the paramedics, and both of them, Andrea Volpe and Elisabetta Ballerin, were transported to the hospital.
Medical personnel quickly understand that the woman is overdosing and revive her just in time. 18-year-old Elisabetta Ballerin is from a well-to-do family in Sommo Lombardo. She and Andrea Volpe share a small isolated cottage in the Gola Secca forest north of Sommo Lombardo.
As soon as she turns 18, Elisabetta drops out of school. Despite the fact that she is a good student, she convinces her father to give her the keys to the family cottage in the country so she can live there with Andrea Volpe.
Andrea Volpe is well known by the authorities. He is unemployed and a well-known drug addict and a Circus of Satan band member. Police even suspect him of dabbling in the sale of narcotics. In the afternoon of January 24, 2004, young Elisabetta Ballerin, still hospitalized, snaps out of her lethargy. She is delirious and mumbles horrendous things about blood and sacrifice.
From her delirious ramblings, caused by her drug-induced semi-comatose state, they concluded that something had happened at the Gola Secca cottage.
Meanwhile, at the Sommo Lombardo police station, things accelerate.
While Elisabetta Ballerin and Andrea Volpe are both in hospital, policemen begin their investigation. And that's when things start to get muddy. While searching Andrea Volpe's little Fiat Uno, Policemen discover that he is not the car's owner. It belongs to a lady that lives around Soma Lombardo. They contact her. It turns out that she is the mother of one Mariangela Pizzotta. The previous day, she had loaned her the car so she could meet with some friends. When policemen tell her they have found her car in a rather sorry state along the dam, and that it had been driven by an Andrea Volpe, the lady immediately tells the police she is very worried. She's worried because she knows this Andrea Volpe. He had been Mariangela's boyfriend for years. Mariangela met Volpe when she was at school at 15 or 16. Until they were 20, they acted like all other young people their age. There was no problem. Then, Volpe left for military service. He came back transformed. He had tattoos, and his behavior had changed. Since we were concerned, Mariangela confirmed that he was having problems, notably with drugs. And their love affair gradually took a turn for the worse. Mariangela tried to help, but ultimately decided to leave him. Despite the fact that the couple had broken up a long time ago, they continued to see each other. Later, we'll even learn that Mariangela was loaning money to Andrea Volpe. From there, the policemen begin to suspect that there is something that's not right in this story. When they find Mariangela Pizzotta's car driven by Andrea Volpe and involved in an accident, they realize that something is wrong.
This mix-up is a bad omen. Where is Mariangela Pizzotta? For the police, it is imperative to go search Volpe and Ballerine's cottage. And when the Carabinieri arrive on the scene, the place seems abandoned.
They enter the house. Remember, it's a summer cottage. It's a very humble lodging at the end of an alleyway. While going through the house, they find it to be extremely squalid. The furniture is upturned, there is garbage throughout the house. The only living presence is that of a boa living in a vivarium. Eventually, they find their way behind the house, where there's a small building used both as a shed and a greenhouse.
It was in that same greenhouse behind the cottage that they found the body of Mariangela Pizzotta, buried under a mound of dirt. Her hands and feet were visible, as the body had been buried rather summarily.
What's even more horrible, the Carabinieri later said, was that the body was still warm, even if the murder had taken place the night before.
For investigators, the time has come to ask Andrea Volpe a few questions.
Shortly after his incarceration, Andrea Volpe decided to confess.
While investigators interrogate the suspect, other officers go to Anna Maria Pizzotta's residence to announce the terrible news. Her daughter, Mariangela, was assassinated in the Gola Seca cottage. At the Soma Lombardo police station, Andrea Volpe denies his implication in the crime.
The first version of Andrea Volpe's testimony was that the gun had been fired by accident. He told the investigator that he was showing Mariangela a gun from his friend Elisabetta Ballerine's father's collection, and that it had gone off accidentally.
At that point, Elisabetta ran up to the scene, and when they saw that Mariangela was dead, they decided not to call for help. Who would have believed them anyway? So they decided to transfer the body to the greenhouse, the shed, behind the house, and bury her summarily.
What's wrong with this version is that it doesn't fit with the evidence found at the cottage. First, the prints found in the snow near the greenhouse suggest the presence of an unidentified accomplice. Second, Volpe's story contradicts many details obtained by Elisabetta Ballerine at the hospital. Interrogated relentlessly, Volpe changes his version of events once again. His variations, aimed at harmonizing with Elisabetta's version, finally draw the police closer to the truth.
On the night when Mariangela was killed, on the eve of her birthday, Andrea Volpe had called her using that specific pretext to celebrate. It was the perfect excuse to convince Mariangela to come visit him at the cottage.
He said that when Mariangela arrived, they both sat down in the dining room, and an argument soon broke out. He took out a gun to threaten her, and the shot accidentally went off, hitting Mariangela in the throat and knocking her over.
Then they panicked. They called their friend Nicola Sapone, as he was rumored to be the head of the group.
When Nicola Sapone arrives at the cottage, Mariangela is unconscious, but she is still breathing. When he notices Mariangela is not dead, Sapone tells him, "You can't even kill a girl."
Then, as the young girl lay dying, they decided to wrap her in a tarp and drag her outside to the little shed. It's only once they were in the shed that Nicola Sapone supposedly took a shovel and hit Mariangela several times in the head to kill her. And then they purportedly tried to summarily bury her and cover her in that same tarp. Then Nicola Sapone would have left the scene after advising Andrea Volpe to get rid of the car by driving it into the river. That's when things started to go wrong.
If the circumstances of Mariangela Pezzotte's murder seem relatively clear, one detail remains obscure. Why? What's behind the murder of this unassuming young woman? To answer these questions, investigators will soon reveal events that will shock all of Italy.
On the evening of January 24th, 2004, precisely, I was watching television around midnight. It was the late news, and I learned that Andrea Volpe and Elisabetta Ballarin have been arrested for homicide. Ballarin's name didn't ring a bell. But when I heard Volpe's name, everything lit up in my head. It was like a Christmas tree. Everything I'd discovered on satanic circles, every document I had collected from the start came back to me.
Michelle Tollis spent the last 6 years investigating the underground activities of the Circus of Satan band members, who participated in supposedly satanic rituals. After all this time, he had acquired the certainty that the demonic activities of Circus of Satan band members, including Andrea Volpe, played a role not only in his son Fabio and Chiara Marino's disappearance, but also in the murder of Mariangela Pezzotte.
On Sunday morning, the first thing I do is to buy the paper, to read about all the details from the case. It's a rather complete article. It even has a picture of Mariangela Pezzotta. I recognize her, having already met her at the time with the group as Andrea Volpe's fiancée. And now here she is, murdered of a gunshot to the throat. It just became a question of simple mathematics, putting 2 and 2 together. In my opinion, either they shot her to shut her up because she wanted to spill the beans, or because she had already talked and they wanted revenge. I phoned the Carabinieri in Sommalombardo, and I talked to Sergeant Segredo, who agreed to meet me in the afternoon. At 2 o'clock, I show up at Sommalombardo station, and I succinctly sum up my research. Dumbfounded, the sergeant just freezes. His face just grows pale. He asked me, "Mr. Tollis, are you sure of what you're suggesting?" I then show him the contents of the black briefcase I had, full of stuff I had picked up on concerts and newspaper articles, posters and notes. There was everything and then some.
In Sommalombardo, investigators are still trying to determine Andrea Volpe's motive for killing his ex-girlfriend. The Carabinieri interrogate Sapone. Informed about his friend's confession, Nicola Sapone denies the whole thing. He admits receiving Andrea's call on the night of January 23rd to 24th, but swears that the victim was already dead when he arrived at the Golaseca cottage. He also says that when he noticed the young woman was dead, he quickly turned around to leave. And the rest is nothing but lies. At this point, it's true that the police have nothing concrete against him. On the one hand, they have Volpe's confession, a drug addict who has continually changed his version of the facts since his arrest. And on the other hand, Elisabetta Ballerin now swears that she remembers nothing of that gruesome night. In the absence of evidence, Nicola Sapone is released but placed under judicial review. Thanks to Michel Tollis's extraordinary secret investigation, the pieces of the puzzle will finally come together. His file on the satanic activities of the beasts of Satan is worthy of an intelligence services investigation.
And this time, despite the years that have gone by, the police, the Carabinieri, listen to Michel Tollis. The lead is very slim, adding up to the discovery of occult elements in Chiara Marino's home. The discovery of the same in the house that Andrea Volpe and Elisabetta Ballerin shared. The fact that the group dabbled in occultism. But for the police, even if these elements are weak, there is at least a reason to follow the trail of occultism.
On the counsel of his lawyer, Andrea Volpe decides to tell everything. On May 17th, 2004. At that time, he tells all. We are a group named the Beasts of Satan. We have committed all those murders. This one, this other one. And here are all the members with their names. These names corresponded exactly with the list I'd given the police.
And then, he will offer up a new version of Mariangela Pizzotta's death. Once again, he will indict his friend Nicola Sapone, but he doesn't present him as a collaborator after the fact. He, in fact, says that Sapone ordered the crime, the murder of Mariangela Pizzotta.
According to Andrea Volpe, the sect had ordered him to murder Mariangela Pizzotta because she was drifting away from the group and because she knew too much. She was therefore becoming a menace to the members.
In his new version, not only does Volpe involve his friend Sapone again, but he affirms that Sapone became completely paranoid since his breakup with Mariangela. Nicola Sapone was afraid that Mariangela would reveal information about Fabia Tollis and Chiara Marino, who both disappeared 6 years before. Volpe adds that Sapone had clearly stated that if he refused to kill his ex-girlfriend, Volpe and his new girlfriend, Elisabetta, would be eliminated.
For the first time, the police will have an overview of the events leading up to the assassination of Mariangela Pizzotta, the motive of which actually going back 6 years to that night in January 1998 at the Midnight Club.
At the beginning of 1998, the Circus of Satan leaders have been participating in a demonic cult for some time, forming an entity within the band, an entity called Beasts of Satan.
This group, the Beasts of Satan, which initially was just a band, began to attract young misfits, addicts, and alcoholics from the area around Milan. Little by little, the group will drift towards Satanism, adoration of the devil. Among the people tacking onto this group, we find Chiara Marino, who will be the only woman, in fact, in the Beasts of Satan. She is 19 at the time, and she has fallen in love with a young man who has recently joined the group, Fabio Tollis, who is 3 years younger than her. This doesn't suit the Beasts of Satan at all, especially the leaders, more influential members of the group than Fabio Tollis, all men which were interested in Chiara Marino. She's been saying for a while that she needs more normality in her life, and she wants to distance herself from the beasts of Satan. So that night, in January 1998, the beasts of Satan got together, first digging a grave in the afternoon in a wooded area near Milan, and then regrouping in the midnight pub and deciding to go out in the forest for a satanic ritual. Fabio Tollis and Chiara Marino are invited to participate. Maybe Fabio Tollis, at the last minute, felt that something was wrong. He tried to separate from the group to avoid going. He told Andrea Volpe, for example, that he wanted to get back home because his father would be worried. And Andrea Volpe, that same night, will force him to call his father and make up the story that he wanted to sleep out that night with Chiara Marino.
That night at the midnight pub, they had left, saying they were going to another discotheque, one of the biggest in Italy, maybe even in Europe at the time, I believe. It was called Nautilus. But instead of going to Nautilus, they changed direction and went into these woods. And Chiara and Andrea thought they were going to perform some stupid ritual. But in fact, as soon as they got out of the car, they immediately attacked the young girls with knives.
Chiara Marino has a pocket knife on her. She barely has time to take it out that Saponi is already on her, and Volpe will also join in. They'll take turns stabbing her. Fabio Tollis will try to intervene, but another member of the group will throw himself on him. This one has a hammer, and he will deal severe blows to the head of Fabio Tollis and literally bash his skull in. So the two dying lovers, Fabio Tollis and Chiara Marino, are thrown in the grave. The other members of the group will convene around the grave and, perhaps as a gesture of contempt, will urinate on the dying bodies. They will bury them, and after they're finished, Nicola Saponi will even do a little dance on the grave saying, "Now you're zombies, try to get out of this hole," or something like that.
The following day, they returned to the spot to douse it with ammonia or something like that, to prevent animals from being attracted by the smell and discovering the body.
So at that time, it seems to be a perfect crime. No one can see how the authorities can begin to find out about this sacrifice. But 6 years later, when this breakup between Andrea Volpe and Mariangela Pizzotta occurs, things begin to take a different turn.
Fabio and Chiara's bodies were found only because Andrea Volpe told them exactly where to dig. And all the while referring only to a row of great trees around the woods of Ticino. He was only off by a few centimeters.
one could have ever guessed that this small wooded area had been the scene of such a gruesome crime.
Venne sottoposta.
Once they had dug up the victims, the forensic team arrived on the scene.
Medico-legale.
Their investigation allowed them to reconstruct the sequence of events leading up to the tragedy that occurred on that fateful night. It was primarily because of the traces from the 64 knife slashes on Fabio's body. These 64 lacerations prove Fabio's desperate attempts to protect himself from the assailant's blades. But despite those efforts, they will finally manage to slit his throat and kill him.
Arrest warrants are issued, and the police widen their investigation, including a series of suspicious deaths within the entourage of the Beasts of Satan. It is suspected that certain followers were pushed to commit suicide.
My son's assassins have practically all been indicted. Their sentences go from life to 9 years in jail for Massimino Magni. Sapone was given 2 life sentences because he's the one who savagely murdered the 2 victims and then profaned the remains of Fabio and Chiara. Paolo Leoni, or Ozzy, considered to be the spiritual guide, the leader of the group, also got life because he's the one who introduced the satanic cult to the group. He was the son of a known Satanist who had also been found guilty of the murder of a woman. In turn, then, Zampolo and Monterosso got 29 years each. Mario Maccione got a life sentence, limited to 19 years in jail because he was a juvenile. And the repentant Volpe was first sentenced to 30 years in jail. But because of his collaboration and his confession, he finally only got 20 years in jail, which was confirmed in appeals court.
The sentences were just for all of the accused. But for Elisabetta Ballerin, in my view, I think the penalty was too severe. She was a young 18-year-old girl, and her role in this was marginal. But she was sentenced to 23 years in jail, while Andrea Volpe, who killed 4 people, was only jailed for 20 years.
Judge Maria Greca Zoncu concluded that the Beasts of Satan members were not criminals inspired by Satanism, but weak individuals, immature and uneducated, creating a world in which reigned total moral misery.
The end result, even if these people knew little about Satanism, is that the devil, if you believe in him, has won, because they caused the death of a number of people.
We need to remember that we can make a lot of ill-considered decisions because of love. Mariangela gave her life simply because she accepted to pay Volpe's debts.
Occult crime or not, the Beasts of Satan affair resulted in nothing but grief, regrets, and certainly remorse.
When the accused show remorse, it's always for themselves. The ones who committed those offenses, those terrible and reprehensible crimes, have asked both me, my family, our families, and even their own families to forgive them. Some of them have even used the papers and the media to do so. Volpe and Guerrieri have expressed their regrets in that way. But when I personally met Volpe at the prison in a face-to-face encounter, I understood just by looking at him that these regrets were just for show. Because for them, evil flows in their veins. It is part of their DNA.
wish that over, I stay down, I was at the West Coast, now I'm